Welcome to another edition of what did Damon call this?
Random thoughts.
Random Thought Thursdays.
Something with random thoughts.
And so today, I actually wanted to spend some time talking about kind of hashing through Gary's sermon on Sunday, correcting all of the not correcting. I thought the sermon was really good. I also thought that I've heard several people talk about the value of the sermon, and I really appreciated how he ended with having us kind of reflect on in our own hearts. Folks who, when we closed our eyes and, bring to mind someone who has offended us or whatever. So what I really wanted to talk about is, who did you bring to mind? I'm teasing. But I wanted to talk about, because I wanted to connect that maybe just a little bit more with some things that are going on in today's, in our times today. And so...
Yeah, I got to sit through both services on Sunday and then re-listen today. And all three times it was just... It's really hard, and I guess this is on purpose, or purposeful through the Spirit, that it's really hard to disconnect what Gary's teaching from what's happening right now.
Right.
It's hard not to have that on your mind as you listen to the sermon.
Yeah. So what I want to do is I want to read, reread verses, and then I want to jump back in and bring up a couple things. So. It says, now finally, this is from 1 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 8. Now finally, all of you should be like-minded and sympathetic, should love believers, should be compassionate and humble, not paying back evil for evil or insult for insult, but on the contrary, giving a blessing, since you were called for this, so that you can inherit a blessing. For the one who wants to love life and to see good days must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. And he must turn away from evil and do what is good. He must seek peace and pursue it, because the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are upon their request. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. And who will harm you if you are deeply committed to what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness, you are blessed. Do not fear what they fear, or be disturbed, but honor the Messiah as Lord in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that's in you. However, do this with gentleness, respect, keeping your conscience clear, so that when you are accused, those who denounce your Christian life will be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, rather than doing evil. And one of the things that Gary brought out, one of the things that we've brought out in 1 Peter is that these men and women who Peter was writing to, he was writing to people that were in a very difficult situation. Christians were in the minority, they were marginalized people, and the emperor, the people who they would be suffering under was Nero, who was a horrific figure in history and would be the catalyst for pretty harsh persecution. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about today, what I don't want to talk about today is to get into some of the details of what's going on. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to have a special guest, my friend from Orchard Knob Baptist Church. He and I are going to sit down and just talk about some of the things that are going on in our society and in our city, and really to hear from his perspective, for us to hear and to maybe look at, as Christians, how do we view some of the things that are going on, and that coming from more than just a white perspective. Hopefully what I want to get towards next week is a Christian perspective.
Yeah.
Rather than a white or black perspective, a Christian perspective on that. So that'll be good to hear somebody who has a different cultural experience than I do.
Yeah.
What I want to do today is talk about, in light of things that are going on, how does this passage inform me and how I should live in light of what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And the contrast I want to make is, I think there is a temptation. It's the old kind of story that you hear of, somebody's preaching a sermon on marriage, and it's talking about how to love your spouse well, and during the sermon, all you're doing is elbowing your spouse that they should be listening.
Right.
Versus you yourself listening and taking note of what's going on. So I don't have a lot of questions, and so I see this maybe being more of a back and forth. But I wanted to lay out maybe first, and BJ has no idea where I'm going, so I'm going to lay this out and give you maybe a chance to respond to this, is why do you think there is a temptation when we hear things like we should be sympathetic, we should be humble, we should not pay back evil for evil, that we should, with gentleness and respect, keep our conscience clear. It's better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. Why do you think we want to jump to desiring that other people apply this towards us than for us, Lewis, applying it? So this gets difficult. So for example, let's say that you and I hold different positions on something. Why do you think there's a temptation for me to say, BJ, you really need to listen to Gary's message?
Yeah, I think it goes back to just this self-centered, sinful, kind of just we can have that knee-jerk reaction of, yes, that's a great message for my brother or my sister in the Lord. And why our mind immediately goes there, other than to explain it from sin and pride. Mm-hmm. Particularly if you've been a Christian for a while and you kind of think of maybe you think of yourself wrongly in this way, but you think of yourself as a mature Christian, you kind of take that message and just want to say, yeah, you know what, he's right, and I know a lot of people who need to hear that. And I don't know if there's just ignorance on our part, or just that unwillingness to self-evaluate and look at our own heart. But it certainly comes back to sin, but I think some of that's that temptation of thinking that we're further along on this walk of sanctification than we truly are.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the issue becomes that we're never, that sanctification process, we never get to where we want to be, and there's always indwelling sin. And so a message like this, a passage like this, should always speak to us. And so I think the thing to think about would be, if that the grid as Christians is to be, how can I magnify Christ in and through my life? It's easy. It's easier to do that when you're alone early in the morning, and you're reading the Bible. You're in your quiet time. When you start adding people, is when this becomes more difficult. Because what happens is that with people comes difference. With that come differences of opinions, and then where this gets really complicated is when you even have Christians who both desire to serve and honor the Lord. However, there are some communication barriers to having conversations around difficult things, whether that's whether or not to wear a mask in public, or your stance on the protest and the things that are going on in our country right now. That instead of being able to have conversation, we we try to demand for the other person to what we would consider take the high road, to act holy, to act humble in humility, when yet everything inside of us ourselves is screaming. And so how do you think that makes it almost impossible to have conversations on tough issues?
Yeah, and as you're speaking on that, I was reminded of a couple things. One is part of the passage where Paul lays out the five. It's verse 8, I think. And Gary talked about those words and talking about being like-minded, and so even if we took an idea of racial injustice, I think the church as a whole is like-minded to say that yes, we think that is wrong and we need to speak out on that. Yet you're coming at it with different ideas because you also have different cultural experiences, and so there's a like-mindedness to a degree, but maybe not in solution. That was one thing I was thinking of. But then also, we tend to try to go about this about social media, and that the lack of a face-to-face conversation, which is why I think next week is going to be a great conversation between you and Carlos. I think that we see it played out more on social media, where you see you're not understanding what I'm saying. You're not understanding what I'm saying, and it's just this back and forth and this desire to be right. And so those were two of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking about that, and just that difficulty of almost getting out of our own way to have that honest communication. But it goes back to your first point: is if we're not willing to evaluate our own heart and how we're coming at whatever the issue may be, it's going to go ahead and pump the brakes on the communication part before it even gets started. Because you're coming at it with an agenda, again, to be right about it.
Yeah. Versus I want to, in my interactions, I want to be seen as humble, loving, kind, peaceful. I think it's fine to be resolved, to be convinced of to be convinced, and they're also so that when people have an interaction with us, they wonder, oh man, he's got a hope inside of him that transcends anything that I may be experiencing. I think what I see in our days with all the issues going on is that there's a tendency to want to kind of shove it down somebody's throat, and I've had some really I have experienced a lot of conversations on all these issues over the past several months with several different people. And one of the things that I find is that if I can quiet my soul and listen, what I find is that I'm able to love that brother or sister better, and they walk away feeling loved, even if there's not a total agreement on the issue at hand. Yeah. So, an example would be, at the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of conversations going on about when to cancel church, when we come back, how should we come back, what should we do? And really, I feel like that because the tone was constantly, and it was really prayed through, of love and charity and giving one another the benefit of the doubt and trying to walk humbly, that I feel like that paved a way for things to Not that people still don't have difference
Right.
of opinions on that, but that it paved the way to say, oh, their intentions and their motivations aren't bad.
Yeah, and I think that's the difference, because I've had conversations with folks as well on all the issues that have been going on recently, mostly the pandemic and the racial injustice issues. And what I find, particularly because I'm speaking primarily with Christians here, is that there is genuine conviction, even if the convictions may oppose even what I think or what another brother or sister thinks. Their convictions are genuine, so that I know that their intention is they're thinking through this biblically, even if there's not agreement. So.
Yeah, and where this gets super difficult is that this does get super difficult in our days with the issues we're talking about, because they're not light issues.
No.
They have positions taken on these issues have serious consequences. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it inflames. The problem becomes, like you were saying, and I think as Christians we need to engage in these conversations. Now I think a lot of people would say, no, don't engage in any of those conversations, just duck your head and hopefully it'll go away.
And I think that's been the approach probably from the church for a bit on some of these things.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Versus, no, let's engage.
Yeah.
It's okay to engage in these, but the like-mindedness in this passage is Christ being glorified, the gospel being proclaimed. That's the like-mindedness. And so the question revolves around, how is the gospel proclaimed? How is Christ magnified through the way that I think about certain issues and through the way that I discuss those issues? And so that becomes that becomes really important. And so, 2 weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago, when Damon and I did the series, and we were talking about examining our hearts. This is a passage that gives us a grid, as we were talking about that week, to come back and examine our hearts, that when we find ourselves frustrated and angry, we come back to a passage like this and we say, okay, am I being sympathetic? Am I loving the believers here? Am I being compassionate? Am I being humble? And if everything inside of me is screaming, no, that's where I've got to go back and say, what's wrong?
Yeah.
What's wrong?
Yeah, and Gary pointed out that this, it's Peter's sort of given some exact. Here's exactly how you deal with that. Here's how that self-examination works. Like I said, am I being like-minded, sympathetic, brotherly? And I think far too often we jump into maybe certain issues and completely skip that step. We're not looking at ourselves at all. We're immediately jumping to how the other person is right or wrong.
Yeah, and the other thing, maybe the last thing that I maybe wanted to mention here is this: is that so let's say that you and I were having a conversation where we disagreed about. I'm going to go to a controversial topic, but not as controversial as some other things. But let's say the wearing of masks, and let's say that I was someone who thought that we should be wearing a mask 24/7. We should sleep in them, that sort of thing. And you were someone who said, "Hey, that's taken away my God-given freedom. I don't have to wear a mask whenever I don't want to." And so we're battling over that discussion. The reality is that I should be praying that even if you are upset and coming at me and calling which position? Oh, and saying that I'm turning into a socialist because I think we should be wearing masks, and you're just, calling me all these names. That even in that moment, that this is what Peter is talking about. When insults come, my choice is, do I insult in return? Do I revile in return? Or do I have the inward peace of Christ to be able to say, you know what, I want to love my brother. That may not mean that that doesn't mean necessarily that I say, oh, I agree with you just to get you to shut up.
Yeah.
But it does mean that I demonstrate that I love you. Now, I am with you. I think this is nearly impossible to do on social media.
It is impossible, which is why I avoid all those. I avoid all those things. But I've had conversations in the past, before these issues come up, but issues such as homosexuality, and just there are differences of opinion in the church, whether we want to admit that or not. But being able to communicate as I have a discussion with someone that no, I still love and I care for you, and I'm understanding what you're saying, but perhaps I'm just not in agreement with what you say. But those same conversations, when you look at social media, if you scroll through comments of posts, that understanding isn't there, and I don't know if it's if it's this feeling of freedom that I can say what I want without repercussions because the person isn't in front of me, sort of thing, but possibly. But yeah, it's in having that one-on-one discussion, even if it's over the phone. I mean, you're not maybe seeing facial expressions or body language, and maybe getting an indication that someone's getting upset at a point that you're making by their face or anything like that. Even a phone conversation is better than simply hashing this out on social media. It's just it instead of solving any of the issues, it escalates the issues, and I think we see that in the division in our country as well over various issues. It's magnified and escalated on social media as just points get thrown into the to the web.
Yeah, and I do think one of the things that we originally were going to have the conversation with Carlos. This was going to be the broadcast,
Yeah.
but I've had so much going on this week that I couldn't get everything together, and it was going to be really unfair to him because I wanted to send him questions ahead of time and us have a dialogue, and me catching him cold would have, that's just not fair. But one of the things that I appreciate so much about as he and I have been dialoguing is, and he agreeing to do this, is that he said, hey, yeah, let's get the questions ahead of time because I don't want to react emotionally to something. I want to be able to think and pray through what we're talking about. And I think that approach is so helpful because as he and I have talked extensively together, I have learned so much from him because we're able to dialogue face to face, two friends talking versus, I don't know if some of these tough conversations that started happening 5 years ago. This is our relationship in this and in these waters formed a long time ago. I think if it was over social media, we wouldn't have. It would have.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy to react emotionally when we're not face to face with somebody.
Yeah.
Because we're dehumanizing someone. Someone's. It's just their opinion and thought that we're dialoguing with versus a human being.
Absolutely.
And I think that becomes problematic. So one of the big kind of things and takeaways that I just wanted to throw out there, and I think is much needed in kind of what we're swimming with today, is that there are important, good conversations around all of these issues that we need to be having, and we need to be having them within the church. Because as a church, and I'm talking about global church, we need to be reflecting to the world unity, love, and togetherness. And so we can't leave these conversations literally on the streets. We need to be having conversations. But that's going to mean some hard work, and to be real honest with you, like we could spend we could have seminars on just definitions of terms in order to shape and have conversations.
Yeah.
These are deep waters. So these conversations, everywhere I go, everywhere I've been, this is the topic of conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, Tuesday's my day off from the church. I'm at Southern Champion. Everybody there is grabbing me, wanting to have this conversation.
Yeah.
You know, and so I know it's going on within our body. Should be. It's going on within our body.
Mm-hmm.
So what's important is that we are preparing our hearts to lovingly seek out truth together, so that the world will start asking. I mean, wouldn't it be a beautiful thing if the world looked at the church and how the church was acting and interacting and said, why is it that you all are able to do something different than the world's able to do?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it points back to what Gary said in his sermon. We're sort of called to live in this alternate moral universe with kind of an
Yes. audience
of the world looking on. Again, it connects to the idea of being sojourners that Peter talks about. So we're to live differently because, like it or not, the world is looking on, and it'd be great, like you said, if we sort of follow the biblical example, if we follow Jesus, to say, how are you guys doing this differently than everyone else?
Yeah, and I actually want to take something a step further than Gary took it on Sunday, and so he may want to correct me on this. But one of the things I was just thinking of is you know, obviously I was there for 2 sermons as well. Towards the end, he was talking about you don't know what has happened to that person.
Mm-hmm.
He was talking about, like, you know, somebody who may have cut you off or whatever.
Yeah.
The only place I want to be careful there and so I want to take a step further
Mm-hmm.
than that. I want to say, and I want to be careful how I say this. Sometimes if we take that mind frame, we say something like, oh, maybe that person is on the way to rush home because they have a sick child. Then if we find out through dialogue with them, they're not on their way,
Mm-hmm.
they just like to drive fast. Then all of a sudden we default back into our sinful pattern of wanting to say, well, then how dare you, you jerk, you know?
Right.
And I know that's not what Gary was saying, but I have to be careful how I say this. I want to set it up in that context because no matter what that person's motivation for acting the way they're acting, that doesn't change what my response in the Lord needs to be towards them, because as Gary was saying, we need to be seen as aliens, as living in an otherworldly context. And you know, this gets difficult. And it was very interesting. I'll say this and then I will end. You know, yesterday I had 2 very significant conversations with 2 different people. And what was interesting is that if they were in the same building, but 2 different conversations. What I don't know, they're both dear Christian brothers. If they would have had the conversation they had with me with one another, I don't know how it would have ended. Part of me thinks it might have been a fight, like a fist fight. And I'm not tooting my own horn here. That's not the purpose of this. But being able to dialogue with them, I was able to challenge both of them on some things where I think they were being a little short-sighted. In one case, very short-sighted on some things when it comes to the gospel and loving our neighbor. And the only difference was this was in my mind of, Lewis, walk humbly, be gentle, be kind, pray that the Spirit takes control here. There were times when I felt that I wanted to knee-jerk reaction, and I had to say, oh, Lewis, that's the flesh. You know, walk according to the Spirit here. And many times I'm not good at that, but in this moment it was really interesting to see that, to to see somebody say something like, "Huh, I'm going to have to think and pray about that."
Yeah.
Okay, well, good.
Yeah.
That's what we should be as a church, you know. So, I know we're skirting around some waters, and that we're being vague on some
Right.
things, and that's on purpose today.
Yeah, and that's on purpose because this is maybe the issue of the day, but it certainly isn't the only issue that we'll have and deal with and have hard discussions about either.
No, well, and we're unable to get into the issue of the day, or let me rephrase that. We're unable to address these very important issues that are hugely significant and are meaningful. We are not able to even jump into the waters towards true reconciliatory conversations as Christians, as the church, if I'm not trying to put on the mind and heart of Christ as I have this conversation. If I'm not able to do that, the enemy has won.
Yep.
And so what I want to challenge us as Single Mountain Bible Church is to really think through this grid in having conversations, whether that's with one another or whether that's dialoguing with others. And I would caution us that I feel like what's of first importance is to be able to dialogue as brothers and sisters in the Lord, because if, again, I know I've said this already, but if we are sharply divided, as the world looks at us, they are not going to see hope.
No.
They are going to see the church as a reflection of society.
Yeah.
And that is a very dangerous place for the church to be.
Yeah, I agree.
So, all right. Well, thank you for indulging us for 30 some odd minutes. But we're thankful to be able to have this platform. And like I said, next week I'm very excited to sit down with my friend, my brother in the Lord, Carlos Williams, and he and I have been in conversation for years over these type issues. He is a dear, deeply committed brother in the Lord, a fine minister, a fine preacher, a wonderful prayer warrior, and so I think we'll be blessed and to have some conversations together. So tune in next week.